There's a strange moment that happens when people look back at old clips and suddenly feel uneasy. Not because something new was revealed, but because the world around those clips has changed. What once sounded like exaggerated comedy starts to feel loaded with implication. Jokes don't land the same way anymore. Sarcasm feels sharper, and lines that were once dismissed as nonsense begin to circulate with a different kind of weight. That's the space Jim Carrey has lived in for years. He's an entertainer known for bending reality, distorting social norms, and deliberately unsettling audiences. But as conversations about power, secrecy, and influence have grown louder, people have started asking whether his most uncomfortable moments were just performance or something else entirely. Not because he offered evidence, but because his words seemed to brush up against anxieties people were already carrying. The question isn't whether Jim Carrey exposed anything. The real question is why so many people are now searching his past for meaning, and what that says about how we interpret humor, symbolism, and intent in an age obsessed with hidden truths. And once you start pulling on that thread, it becomes very hard to stop.
From the earliest days of his career, Jim Carrey built his identity around unpredictability. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was dismantling expectations. Faces twisted beyond recognition, voices jumped without warning, and social boundaries were crossed on purpose. This wasn't accidental. Carrey has spoken openly about how much he enjoyed making people uncomfortable, because discomfort forces attention. It breaks passive viewing. His comedy often worked by overwhelming the audience, pushing them past the point where they could easily categorize what they were watching. Was it satire, mockery, parody, or something closer to a social experiment? That ambiguity became his signature. Over time, he leaned even further into it, especially as fame gave him more freedom to play with public perception. He wasn't interested in being reassuring, he wanted reactions. And when someone builds a career on exaggeration and surrealism, it creates a problem years later. Once audiences forget the context, they start stripping away intent. What was once clearly absurd can later be read as intentional provocation. And when trust in institutions erodes, performers who thrived on chaos suddenly look less like comedians and more like possible messengers, whether they ever wanted that role or not.
There are certain talk show appearances that never seem to disappear. They resurface again and again, clipped, reposted, and reframed. Jim Carrey had several of those moments. On the surface, they played like deliberate absurdity, exaggerated gestures, exaggerated accusations, exaggerated confidence. Studio audiences laughed because that's what the format demanded. Late-night television is built on exaggeration and release. But outside that controlled environment, something changes. Years later, people no longer see the laughter. They see only the words and the expressions, detached from timing and tone. What once felt like mockery starts to feel confrontational. The more those clips are replayed, the more people project intention onto them. Was he joking, or was he testing how much he could say without being taken seriously? That question becomes impossible to answer definitively because comedy doesn't leave behind clear transcripts of intent. It leaves impressions, and impressions are easily reshaped by whoever is watching, especially when the cultural climate is already primed to believe that powerful systems hide behind humor and distraction.
American award shows are strange spaces. They're public, celebratory, and deeply performative. But they also place artists in front of the very systems that reward them. Jim Carrey used those moments to speak in broad, philosophical terms about identity, power, and illusion. He avoided specifics. He didn't name names. Instead, he leaned into abstraction. That vagueness is part of why his speeches continue to circulate. When language is open-ended, it invites interpretation. Some viewers heard social critique, others heard spiritual reflection, and some heard warning signals. None of those readings can be fully disproven because the words were never anchored to clear claims. Over time, those speeches were pulled out of context and stitched into narratives that went far beyond what was actually said. The ambiguity became fuel. When people are already suspicious of authority, abstract criticism starts to feel like coded language. And once that idea takes hold, even silence can be interpreted as confirmation.
Conversation doesn't stay contained. They radiate outward, pulling unrelated material into their orbit. The Epstein case did exactly that. It triggered a wave of re-examination, not just of names and documents, but of culture itself. People began searching for signs they believed they had missed. Old interviews, jokes, photos, and speeches were reinterpreted through a new lens. Jim Carrey became part of that process, not because of direct involvement, but because his past words were already ambiguous enough to fit into existing suspicions. This is how retroactive meaning works. Events don't change the past, but they change how the past feels. Once trust collapses, people stop asking whether something is proven and start asking whether it feels consistent. And feelings travel faster than facts. In that environment, even exaggerated comedy can be reframed as foresight, and metaphor can be mistaken for disclosure.
Online spaces reward connection, not caution. Isolated moments are rarely left alone. They're grouped, layered, and woven into stories that feel coherent, even if the connections are thin. The more disturbing a claim sounds, the more attention it draws. Algorithms don't measure truth, they measure engagement. That dynamic encourages escalation. Mild speculation becomes certainty. Unrelated clips become patterns. And once a narrative forms, dissent starts to look like denial. Jim Carrey's material fits easily into this system because it's already extreme by design. His expressions, his language, his willingness to sound unhinged all make for compelling fragments. Taken alone, they're entertainment. Combined, they can feel like evidence to someone already convinced that nothing powerful operates transparently. This isn't unique to him, but his style makes him especially vulnerable to reinterpretation.
In recent years, Jim Carrey has stepped back from the spotlight. Fewer appearances, fewer roles, fewer explanations. For most celebrities, that would be unremarkable. But when someone associated with controversy goes quiet, silence becomes part of the story. Absence invites projection. People fill gaps with assumptions. Some see exhaustion, others see disillusionment, and some see retreat after saying too much. The truth may be far simpler, but simplicity rarely satisfies an audience trained to look for hidden layers. When someone known for speaking loudly stops speaking altogether, it creates a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled with theories, interpretations, and narratives that say more about the audience than the person at the center.
In the end, the Jim Carrey conversation isn't really about him. It's about how modern audiences process uncertainty. Comedy, symbolism, and abstraction don't age well in times of distrust. What once functioned as exaggeration can later feel prophetic, not because it was accurate, but because people are searching for meaning wherever they can find it. Jim Carrey blurred lines on purpose. He challenged comfort. And now, years later, those blurred lines are being traced over by people trying to make sense of a world that feels increasingly opaque. Whether that search reveals anything real is still an open question. But the fact that so many people are asking it tells us something important. When faith in clear explanations disappears, even jokes start to sound like warnings.